But lesson number 3 tonight on the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, and what we can learn about that. While everyone keeps gathering in, let me thank those that came and participated in the Southeast lectureship, our elders, Brother Howard, Brother Dan. There may have been some others of you that were present, either physically or you might have watched online. It was a good program. It actually is concluding this evening, probably right as we speak, since they're an hour ahead of us. And Brother and Sister Lipe remained over there for the conclusion of that good week of study. But we're thankful that we could be a part of that. And the leadership there, Brother Will, thanked us for the way that we support the school as a congregation. And I pass that note of gratitude on to you as well. But tonight, the 10 Commandments, commandment number 3. Some of you have heard me tell this little story before. My clicker's not working, guys. We'll try to turn it on, turn it back off. All right, Jim will fix it. He'll show you momentarily an exasperated man sitting down by his push lawnmower. And the story goes that the preacher was walking down the sidewalk and he saw, a push mower for sale. And he inquired about it, and a little boy told him the price, and the preacher said, well, that's a good price. I think I'll take it. And so he exchanged the money, and he started to push his purchase home, and the little boy called out and said, now, preacher, I have to tell you, there he is. He said, that's a cussing lawnmower. And the preacher said, what do you mean, son? He said, well, preacher, you got to cuss it to make it start. He said, well, son, I'm not that kind of man. I try to follow the Lord, and live like Jesus, and that won't be happening. Little boy said, well, you pull it long enough and it will. Trying to get it to start. Some of us, we get frustrated, and sometimes there are words that escape, that we don't really want to escape. But that's kind of how it happens. This is a quote from our first president. Quote, the foolish and wicked practice of profane cursing and swearing is a vice so mean and low that every person of sense and character detests and despises it. Well, that's what President Washington said, but it's unfortunate that some of our last few, at least, commanders-in-chief did not agree with our first as it regards the use of vulgar language. However you want to classify or describe them, dirty words, crude speech, both from the young and old alike, those can frequently be heard. And as I put in your workbook, millions who have never navigated any body of water are still fully capable of cussing like a sailor. I guess those of you that have actually served in the Navy or been around those engaged in maritime navigation might know more of the impact of that old cliche than those of us who have not. But unfortunately, we know that we live in a time period when speech and words are often used that should not be. Worst of all, maybe sadder still, those guilty of despicable dialogue might fit the description in Jeremiah 6 and again repeated in Jeremiah 8 as the nation teetered on the brink of God's judgment and destruction. This covers a wide range of different sins and transgressions of which they were guilty, but Jeremiah, very picturesque language that he utilizes when he questions, were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush. All of us probably have said things that in a moment of anger or frustration or whatever might have prompted it, that as soon as that word escaped from our mouth, the tinge of conscience, the feeling of guilt was immediate, and we had that sense of instant regret. And if others heard what we said, we expressed our sorrow and remorse, and our shame was seen, usually in the flushing of our face. We blushed. We were embarrassed by that. But today that's not the case. And like I said, that unfortunately describes almost everyone. Probably our school teachers can tell you, some of our youngest children, the type of language that they use on the playground or in the classroom even is such that they don't even give it a second thought. They're not embarrassed at all. And that's a sad indictment on our society and culture presently, but I believe it to be an accurate one nevertheless. Well, let's read together. This is Exodus chapter 20. That's where we've started every night. Verse number 7 says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." Deuteronomy 5 and verse 11, when Moses repeats for the second generation these same 10 words, it says much the same, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." That is the command for our consideration this evening. Now, this commandment, and later on we'll go to Matthew chapter 5, and I hope to show you the interest in how Jesus uses probably what this command was intended originally to really address, but then we'll also expand on that somewhat as well. This command, though, deals both with inward thought and outward expression. Somebody might say, well, it's okay as long as you don't say it, I can just think it. I don't know if you've ever had that type of rationale or justification used on you or tried to use it yourself. Well, I don't think that really flies. Certainly this command does deal with what we think inwardly, and then that does come out outwardly with our words, but either whether or not our thinking is flawed and our words follow, or just one, this commandment would regulate both, I believe. Corrupt words are used in communication by the masses of people, but this command seems to be originally a prohibition about the misuse of God's name. In fact, if you're reading what we call one of our modern versions, that's kind of, I guess, an unusual way to say it, but versions that have been translated in the last, anywhere from the last 30 to 40 years and more recent than that, many of them, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," they will instead render it, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God," or some equivalent to that. And at least the study that I've done, that's probably fairly accurate and actually probably even closer to the verbiage that would have been understood by the original hearers of this idea of taking the name of the Lord your God in vain, not misusing the name of God, and especially as that misuse might have applied or might have been utilized in the making of false oaths or vows. And there are a number of Old Testament passages that deal with this sort of thing. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse number 12, in the Holiness Code, as it's called, the book of Leviticus has a number of instructions that are given so that God's people might be holy and set apart. And many of them, of course, are built on this scaffolding, if you will, of the Ten Commandments. And so in verse number 12 of Leviticus 19, God says, "You shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." So do not swear by my name falsely in that manner, nor profane the name of your God. That word profane, as it's used, of course, can refer to the idea of an unauthorized sort of usage. It's used back in Leviticus chapter 10 for the profane fire offered by Nadab and Abihu, something that God had not authorized them to give. They thought it perhaps not to be of great consequence, but it cost those boys their lives, as you recall. So do not use the name of your God in an unauthorized and improper, and we might just use the word an unholy fashion, and that's important. Now, again, that command, as you continue to read your Old Testament, and as it relates to this idea of false oath, will be repeated. Jeremiah 5 and verse 2, there is the condemnation of those who swear falsely. Though they say, "As the Lord lives," surely they swear falsely. You can see what they're doing, and still it's a frequent tactic by some people today. And they say, "I swear by," and then they will use God's name to somehow buttress or substantiate their claim. You can know I'm telling the truth because I'm invoking God, as it were. Well, invoking God or not, people in Jeremiah's day, just as today, they use it in a frivolous fashion and don't really mean it at all. Jeremiah 7 verse 9, again, the temple sermon, as it's sometimes called. Jeremiah stands in the gate of the Lord's house, and I think this is just such just an amazing passage of Scripture when you try to picture where Jeremiah is and what he's actually saying and the courage it took to say what he said on this occasion. But in verse 9, among the catalog of things that they had done that deserved God's judgment and His strong condemnation, will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal, and walk after other gods whom you do not know? Interestingly, you see that listing, and even as you've noticed it already, probably if you think about it within the context of the Ten Commandments, there might be a temptation to say, is this really equivalent? Does it carry as much weight, just something that I say? Is it really as bad or as serious or consequential as murder or stealing or committing adultery? Now, of course, God has as much common sense as I do. He's got a lot more, in fact, and much more common sense than any of us do. But there are people that sometimes say, a sin is a sin. You've heard people say that. So if a sin is a sin and I steal a paper clip from, the office downstairs, I'm just as guilty as if I murder someone, while I'm robbing the 7-Eleven tonight after services. You'd say, well, no, that's not exactly right. Each sin, they're both sin, but the consequences are certainly greater in one than the other. And you're right, and of course that's how God made us to reason. But here you cannot say, well, swearing falsely, it's like stealing the paper clip. No, because of the sins that He lists with it, it's very serious. Stealing, murdering, committing adultery, burning incense to some other god, Jeremiah says, serious problem indeed. Zechariah 5 verse 4. Zechariah promises destruction to the thief and to the person who swears falsely by the name of God. Again, you can see the companion of those who are guilty of that. And then in Malachi chapter 3 verse 5, again, the person guilty of misusing God's name is grouped together with the sorcerer or adulterer, those who oppress the poor, widows and orphans, and those who refuse to fear the Lord. So clearly, we have a command here, a prohibition that was very, very serious indeed, and not one to be brushed off lightly or taken with no regard. And we need to take pause, and of course we're going to do this as we bring the lesson to a close and say, well, we're not living then under that law or that system, but what about our speech today? Is it still something that should be more closely monitored than it is? Here's a question, and I didn't leave you any blank space, really just a little bit of a blank space there in your workbook, but I'd welcome your feedback now or any discussion you want to have. Why do you think most people in our day give so little reverence and attention to the proper use of God's name? Why do you think that's the case? What do you think?
It seems like it's all right to not respect people. And I don't think that God has ever commanded us to do anything that's bad for us. And I think that He don't want us to, I think when we show disrespect, other people watching that, and they say, that's a disrespect. How can you really like a disrespect a person? God doesn't want a Christian or, obedient person in this time to be a disrespectful person. But while we do it, I think that over time, we sort of taught ourselves that it's all right to disrespect.
And it impacts, as Donald said, disrespect, the kind of the number one thing that permeates every segment of our society. I think that's absolutely correct.
Us to it in our media exposure.
The media that we consume has certainly aided us in, promoting this sort of disrespect. It's been couched in terms, where, we need to promote equality. This is a big can of worms, and I don't want to even crack the lid on it, but and people prognosticate about these sorts of things and say, who's the evil genius, so to speak, who's the Go back to Adam's invitation last Wednesday night. Who's the Wizard of Oz turning all the buttons and knobs behind the curtain? And some would say, the Soviets realized communism wouldn't work if it was promoted outright. But if they could begin, and other people say, Islam figured out they could not come in and do it, outright. But if we could begin to tear down some pillars of Western civilization that's based on the Judeo-Christian ethic, then we'll have in time an opportunity to sweep in with our totalitarian, regime or ideas, whether that's communism or Islam or whatever. There'll be a void there, and, we'll sweep in and gain power. Again, that's a big can of worms over here, and I don't want to, really explore that, but maybe there is something to that. We have to eliminate that idea of respect. We have to eliminate that reverence that people once had.
Piggyback off Mr. Brady and the other brother's comment, and I think that we do, and to your point, it's like any other apostasy.
Right.
No one you don't go from being on fire for the Lord, wake up the next day and no, I'm an atheist. You drift.
Yep.
You drift. And like they were saying, you get comfortable with, and with tolerating so much, and then as you get more and more comfortable with that, your tolerance of it builds, you become desensitized to it, and you drift into those things.
Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, how did we get here? And that's the hard question to answer, Doug, back there. Yep.
Got desensitized to it, it didn't make it an important thing, it don't mean anything.
Right. And education, we say education's the answer. Well, correct education and truth and, godly matters is the answer. But not to disparage, I know we have our public educators, and I love each of you. You're lights in darkness, you know that. But you know that there are in places where, this very idea, you watch the news, and whether it's about anti-Semitism or, some other, cause, back when it first, I think it's been within my lifetime. Well, no, I take that back. We're going back a little bit farther than that. I don't go all the way back to the Vietnam era, but you remember the first time you saw someone burning a flag on television. Was that during the Vietnam era? I guess they did that during the Vietnam era. It predates me a little bit, but I remember any time they would show anything like that on the news, I could just look over at my daddy and, steam was coming out of his ears. And I was just glad he was sitting on our couch and not there, with some, whatever he'd like to call, I'd like to teach that punk a lesson, the old Clint Eastwood sort of thing. And he would have, but you see, that's what's advocated in some of our higher institutions of learning. Ivy League schools that are supposedly the cream of the crop, are advocating all of these sorts of things and have for several generations now. So, maybe all of that and more. Dennis, yes.
Yesterday, in the United States, 150 universities had riots and protests for Hamas. And anybody with open eyes can see what Hamas is.
Yeah, and what they advocate and carry out.
150.
Wow. And so,
To that brother's point about, what you being, not being taught. See, that's the failure of our generation in not teaching them. And then, but we were taught, and that just goes to what the Hebrew writer said in chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we've heard, lest we drift away.
Yep.
And that's sad.
And that is sad, and that's where we're at. So we have to, work to stem the tide. We have to stand in the gap, whatever type of language you want to use. It's a formidable task that's before us, but that's what we have to do. Now, here again, just by way of discussion, how do most people use the name of God in a frivolous or unnecessary way? We're going to talk about using or misusing the name of the Lord your God in vain, but there's also this idea, like we said, that you can swear falsely, but there's also the idea that you can carry the name of God. Some people say that's the way they would have understood this verse. Do not carry the name of the Lord your God improperly. And the idea of carrying is just using it in all of your transactions, and that's the way that their society was based, more so maybe than ours in some respects. But do people use God's name in a frivolous and unnecessary way today? For sure they do. And that's something that here, this is on the bottom, so let me just read it. I can make a better point if I'll just read what I've written, and I didn't actually write this. This is actually a quote from a Jewish commentator that Roper cites in his commentary. He said, quote, "The Hebrew word translated take, you shall not take. That word take means to take up or swear, and he is here an ellipsis for to take upon the lips, that is, to utter the divine name." He also noted that the term vain can mean falsely. The ambiguities, that is, remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago, not every specific, explicit, law was contained in these 10 words. These are general statements, but anything that gets you in the ballpark, this prohibition would cover. So the ambiguities allow for the proscription of perjury by the principals in lawsuits, swearing falsely, and I thought this was interesting, the unnecessary or frivolous use of the divine name. And so that's something, again, that the Jewish people would have taken very, very seriously and still do today, a lot of them. Now, what is this idea about swearing falsely and using oaths? I told you we'd go to Matthew 5, so let's just go ahead and flip over there now. And let's make sure we understand both what you might say is allowed and is not allowed. And admittedly, in Matthew 5:33, just to read the passage as Jesus spoke it, "Again you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you," now Jesus said, "You've heard it said." Where had they heard it said? He's probably referencing this third of the 10 Commandments. That's what you heard. That's what God gave Moses and our fathers in times past. "But I say to you," you remember that frequent formula. He uses it all throughout chapter 5. He says, "Do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is His footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one." I remember reading that and say, well, okay, I can't swear at all. Is that what Jesus meant? I cannot take an oath whatsoever. And there are religious groups who have understood it that way. The Quakers most notably say, in their understanding, this is a passage that prohibits any taking of any oath of any sort, even in a court of law. So if you were called to the witness stand and asked, "Do you swear?" They would not swear. Now, there's a provision to say, "I can affirm." What's the difference between swearing and affirming? That's a legal, wrangling sort of question. But what Jesus is addressing is that the Jewish religious leaders, and then permeating down to the people, had devised methods that allowed them for evasion and loopholes. And you remember we said when we did the introduction, the 10 Commandments aren't about, here are some things that you can observe generally, but you can look for technicalities and loopholes and disclaimers and fine print to avoid, what these commands entail. That's not their intention whatsoever. So, or with that mindset, in the time of Christ, even it was popular for many who would make an oath or swear by this or that, and Jesus lists some of the things that they might have sworn by other than God, heaven, the earth, your head, whatever. He said, don't swear by those. In other words, what they had done, evidently, was feel like, as long as I don't say that I'm invoking God's name in this promise that I'm making or this oath that I'm taking, I'm free to break whatever agreement or promise, just so long as I don't use the name of God. Now, what Jesus is doing, He said, I'm raising the bar. And He said, you say yes or no. If you say you're going to do something, do it. You don't have to add God on as a witness because He is already. You don't have to invoke some sort of swearing or oathing that you think adds more punch to your words. Your word should be good enough, honest and trustworthy, a person of integrity you should be, so as to just say yes or no, and more than that, it's from the evil one. That's really what He's trying to get at and draw them toward understanding. Now, to show you that that's the case, some people say, well, I still don't like that idea of maybe making an oath, or, if you will, keeping God out of every transaction, or what do you really mean? Well, He knows everything. He demands honesty in all of our dealings. Jesus was asked under oath, you remember, by the high priest in Matthew 26, while He's on trial. This is just a fascinating exchange between these two, I would say, individuals. Jesus is more than an individual. He's certainly the Son of God in flesh. But Matthew 26, 63, or verse 62, the high priest arose and said to him, to Jesus, do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify against you? Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now just think about, this is dripping with irony, isn't it? The high priest doesn't realize what he's asking or the methodology that he's employing, how outrageous it is. I put you under oath by the living God. In essence, swear by yourself if you are the Christ, the Son of God. It is as you said. Verse 64, Jesus said, nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you'll see the man sitting at the right hand of the power coming on the clouds of heaven. That kind of echoes back to what we talked about Sunday night, Mark 13, Matthew 24. But he said, you want me to tell you if by God I am God? Yeah, I am, in fact. And there has been no truer statement ever spoken. Paul uses that sort of approach, surprisingly, more than once in some of his writings when he is writing to the Christians at Rome, and he's telling them of what his proposed plans are. He said, God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers. God is my witness. He knows that I'm true. Later, after extolling the wonderful gospel message and then turning back to the Jews who rejected it, he said, I tell the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit. So with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, with God in His totality, Paul said, I have pure intentions. I have noble desires to tell you His gospel and to have your obedience to it. Galatians 1:20, again to the churches of Galatia, he's talking about, again, the things that he did as it related to his conversion. Concerning the things which I write to you, indeed before God I do not lie. He's calling God as a witness. And so is he doing that to give any sort of ammunition for those who would accuse him falsely? I don't think so. He's just simply trying to assert, I'm being truthful with you. Philippians 1 verse 8, God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And so Paul is not in violation, I don't think, of what Jesus said not to do in Matthew 5. And this gives us at least some understanding that if there are times, and I guess the most common time might be in some sort of legal transaction, if we were called to give testimony or a deposition or something of that sort, and we were asked that with God's help would we tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, we could affirm yes we could without any, again, violation of what Jesus here says in Matthew 5. Now that's something that you might say, well, that still doesn't sound like taking the name of the Lord in vain. What's that really about? Before I get there, I just want to make this point. While you don't read, again, that statement, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, as a command given to New Testament Christians. I don't find that language verbatim anywhere in the Gospels or the epistles. The New Testament makes it very clear what God's expectations are for our speech, for our words, for our spoken communication, and even in other forms of communication. Colossians 4 verse 6, let your speech be always seasoned with what? With salt. Sounds like a weird idea. Carry around a salt shaker and sprinkle some on your tongue. Some of you might like to do that. Probably not good for your blood pressure. But he's saying, weigh your words properly. Make sure that they are wholesome and godly. Make sure that you know how to answer each person as you should answer them. And that's something that, again, probably, I say this including myself. If it doesn't include you, feel free to, step out of the characterization. But I think most of us would say, I can still improve in that area. I can still do a better job than what I am doing. The older women are to teach the younger women. The older men are to teach the younger men. And while here younger men are the last category of people that Paul has addressed as he writes to Titus, I think it applies to men and women universally, to all of us. verse 8, Titus chapter 2, he said, sound speech. That is, this is what you are to show in your life. Sound speech that cannot be condemned. That one who is an opponent may be ashamed, have nothing evil to say of you. The word sound, I know that word's thrown around a lot today in a religious setting. Sometimes we say, well, sound congregation. You know what the word sound means as used in the original language? Is anyone familiar with the etymology of that word? It means literally healthy. It was used to describe, for instance, after a broken bone. Probably most of us have had at least one, if not multiple, broken bones. And if you have a broken bone, when that bone heals and returns to the strength so that you can rely upon it again, it's said to be sound once more. I guess we'll just take a popular one. If you break a hip, there's a period of time where you have to do some rehab. There's some time where you're not able to count on that hip. You can't put your weight on it without it crumbling with underneath you. But hopefully after rehab and therapy and all the things that our great medical technology can do today, there comes a time where you can stand again. And you might even be brave enough, you could stand on one foot or the other. You could put all of your weight on that hip. It's sound again. You can be sure that you can count on it. And here, this healthy speech, people need to be able to count on it. That cannot be condemned. You see how it's kind of defined for you by Paul's use of the negative. Not speech that can be condemned. Not double entendre. Not innuendo. And we're going to talk about some of that in just a little while. And then the most extensive discussion of our speech in James chapter 3, the Lord's brother tells us, the tongue's just like a little spark. You can burn the whole forest down with just a spark. We saw that in Gatlinburg, didn't we, a few years ago? The tongue is a world of iniquity. It can cause problems, of such a tremendous nature. And all of us have had that unfortunate experience that I alluded to earlier. We've said something and we know right at the moment that we've said it and it's escaped off the tip of our tongue, but as it does, we're almost grabbing for it, trying to pull it back in. Have you ever done that? I've almost found myself doing that. I said something, I realized as soon as I said it, I shouldn't have said it, and I'm trying to grab it and pull it back in. Well, you can't catch it. To pull it back in. And so James says, be careful. And further, he says, I love how he describes your spring, fresh water, or I always think about going, when we grew up in Jackson County, Macon County was an adjoining county. Those of you that have been to Red Bowling Springs know that you can go on the square and you can get you some fresh water out of one well, and just down the street a little ways there's a sulfur well. And I don't know why anybody would want to drink that, but maybe some of you had to growing up. But James says, out of that same fountain, there's good water and bad water. There's out of the same tongue, blessing and cursing. And he said, my brethren, these things ought not to be so. And indeed they shouldn't be. So that brings it down to a very practical kind of time of discussion that we will use to conclude over these last 7 or 8 minutes. What about euphemisms? And that's a broad term that I'm including a lot under it. And what one guy, he described them as Christian cuss words. Christian cuss words. Now, don't misuse God's name. That's clear. But are there things that we can sometimes say that might get us close to that line that we ought to avoid? I like to use myself as examples because I've done plenty of stupid stuff, so you can look at my life and say, don't do that. So here's one of the, go ahead, I'll let Clyde speak.
What about Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, verse number 4, talks about just and right. It says, He is the rock, His word is perfect, for all His ways are judgment, a God of truth, without iniquity, just and right is He. God expects us to just tell it like it is, tell the truth.
Yeah, to imitate His nature, and He is a holy God, and He wants us to be holy in all of our respects. And that certainly applies to our speech as well, doesn't it? To give you my example, growing up watching Mickey Mouse, you remember Mickey Mouse and all of his friends. Mickey Mouse has a friend named Goofy. What's Goofy's favorite word, if you're not too afraid to say it? Gosh. He puts an R in it, G-A-R-S-H, Garsh. And I remember one of the first times I said that in the presence of my grandmother. And she nearly knocked my head off my shoulders. And I was like, what was that for? And she said, you don't use that. That's a bad word. I was like, well, Goofy says it, in my cartoon. I don't care what Goofy says. And then she proceeded to give some other words. Garsh, or you can leave out the A and the R and put in an O and say gosh. And there's a lot of things like that. And there maybe again with that generation that they would consider euphemistic words that somehow would get you close to the misuse of God's name. Is that something we should avoid? Is that something, and again, they're Christian cuss words. Some of you have probably heard Brother Dan Winkler talk about his dad, Brother Wendell, and if there was ever a good and godly righteous man, I think it would be he. But Brother Dan was mentioning about Brother Wendell. He said his favorite word was foot. He said my daddy would get mad at something, he'd say foot. And some good, well-intentioned brother or sister caught him one time and gave him a good tongue lashing about his use of that. I think as Brother Dan said it. I've used words that I didn't know, being a good Southerner, that are very offensive to folks that were born and raised north of the Mason-Dixon line. They told me I shouldn't say that. And I had no idea that they had any other connotation other than that. I think what we should do about those is be sensitive to people. And if someone says that's offensive to me, then you don't want to just pour salt on the wound and say, well, I can do whatever I want to. I'm a Christian. I have the liberty to do that, especially if they're another Christian. I can put that aside. I can try not to do that. But we ought to be careful, because do words and connotations change over time and context? They do. And again, at the risk of being too explicit, but nevertheless it's there, especially if you're reading, as I heard one good brother refer to it, it was either yesterday or Monday at Carnes. He said there's old king and there's new king. He was talking about our versions, old king and new king, so you know what he's talking about. And he said in the old king it says this, and in the new king it says that. Well, on the old king there's a word used for a beast of burden that in the new king we call by the more updated term donkey, right? It's in there. You know what I'm talking about. Now, again, is that something we should be aware of, especially, I think Brother Lapp talked about this one night when he talked about, your context for evangelism, for instance. If you were going to go into New York City or Los Angeles, taking Old King with you to try to talk to people in that setting might not be as effective as doing something that would be more updated with language that would be easier for them to grasp. And so words change their meaning, their connotation, depending on that in context. And so I think we should be cautious if we're going to insist that, certain words are off limits. Now, at the same time, I don't think we should use our words flippantly, like I said, just throwing them out there so as to, be intentionally offensive or to get close to this idea, whereas people might have the even thought, I thought they were a Christian and they used language like that. We never need to give them that impression at all. Kind of related to this, does our speech involve only what we say, or does it also include what we write, text, and type? You noticed how some people will never, you would think, at least in my dealings with a lot of them, I've never heard them use verbal speech in the same way that I've read what they've put on the internet for everybody to see, on a social media site or through a text message. Here's the easy way, and we want to talk about the misuse of God's name. I admit, Amy's kind of got me hooked. I like some of the, decorating shows. I like to, watch people take, a dilapidated house and turn it into, a very fancy, updated new dwelling. I can't do anything like that. I can't build a birdhouse, but, it helps Amy just for me to sit by her and say, it'd be nice, if I could do that, but I can't. But, the first thing that always happens, they open the front door and the three words that jump right out of the mouth of every couple, oh my, and then God's name is employed. And you may say, well, I'm not going to do that, and you shouldn't. That's, I think, what Exodus 20 is warning us against. But there are people who will write out by way of acronym in a text, OMG, which stands for the same thing. They'll use other language, again in written or typed form in some sort of posting that, again, will survive. So what we say and how we say it applies not just to our speaking, but also to our writing and otherwise. And I'll just close by asking this, or just probably telling you this. The Jews took this commandment so seriously that they refused to speak God's covenant name. What is His covenant name? Well, the translators of the ASV in 1901 thought it was Jehovah. Scholarship since that time, with other discoveries, Dead Sea Scrolls and things of that nature included, said that probably God's covenant name is closer to Yahweh or Yahweh. But they would not even include the vowel citations so as to know how God's name should be actually properly pronounced. And so we've just got 4 consonants. It's called the Tetragrammaton. And they regarded God's name with that sort of holiness. Now, can we speak God's name? Yes, because I think Scripture gives us an example of people who do in worship and in praise and in prayer and sharing it with others, but never improperly, never disrespectfully. Right.
It always has to be Adonai, and I mean, that tells you say Adonai.
Yep.
Every time.
They're very serious about it, and there are scattered episodes throughout history, probably not that scattered, where Jews have taken the lives of other people for misusing God's name. I mean, that's how serious they are. Now, there's one other idea that I'll leave you with, and I didn't explore it in the workbook, and I've really not given it enough research or study to know. Some would say this command would also be all-encompassing to say that anything done in God's name, that is, any sort of religious evil. And whether that's, we would like to point and say, well, that's what Islamic extremists do. Their shout before they detonate a bomb that kills themselves and other innocent bystanders is a shout of praise to Allah, their God. Allah Akbar. God be praised. God is great. And so it could be that this command would prohibit, and I think certainly it does, that sort of thing. But you could look within Christianity and see at times when God's name, God's righteousness has been used in a certainly unrighteous way. Spanish Inquisition, for instance. But notice this is the last part of verse 7. I know everyone's ready to come back in. How serious is this command? You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I don't want to get anywhere close to that. Why? Interestingly, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And some say that phrase, will not hold him guiltless, the Lord will not forgive. I think that probably goes a little bit too far, but God says, if you want to be sure of being punished by me, misuse my name. And you take that combined with what Jesus says about, for instance, blasphemy of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, you can probably make a case about the seriousness of this command. But that's what we've studied tonight. So let us be people of pure speech. Let us be people that our speech never causes another to stumble. When we do speak improperly, when we do misuse our words, whether in tone or in content, let's repent quickly. Let's make amends with those that we might have sinned against and seek God's forgiveness as well. Next week, we'll look at the important commandment number 4. We hope you'll be with us to study that then.